Hi everyone, welcome to our last weekday night bite of the year. The year's gone really, really quickly, I have to say, in terms of the amount of events we've had, and I can't believe it's already July. But we're going to finish off the year in style tonight with a book launch for Stella Gaynor's new book, Rethinking Horror in the New Economies of Television. And Stella's here. We've got a panel as well. Welcome, Stella. And we've got the chair tonight, Lindsay Hallam. So I'm going to hand over to you, Lindsay, if that's okay, to take things forward from here. And just before I hand over to Lindsay, just a reminder, I've put it in the chat as well. Feel free to use the chat throughout, your comments, your thoughts, they're welcome throughout the discussion. But if you could hold back on your questions until we get to the Q&A part of the session, just so we're not missing questions for Stella and her panelists in the chat. So if you could hold back till then, that'd be appreciated. So over to you, Lindsay.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Thank you also to Shellie and Laura and the BAFTSS Horror Studies Group for hosting this event. It's an absolute honor to be the chair for this event. I've watched Stella give lots of papers over the years, so it kind of feels like this is a culmination of so much research that she's been doing over the past probably 3, 4, 5 years, it feels. And I always look forward to Stella's conference papers, not only because she does a brilliant research, but also I feel like if this academia thing doesn't work out, she can have a really good career in stand-up comedy. So and we're sure we'll get some of that tonight. As Kate said, please do use the chat as you go along, but save your questions. So I'll try and give us an hour for our discussion with Stella and with our other panelists. And then from around 8 o'clock, we should have at least half an hour for Q&A and for everyone to get involved. So please do think of some questions. So we should have a decent amount of time to take questions from everyone. But just hold off, and then until I kind of say around 8 o'clock, and we can start off. So first off, so Stella, I always want to ask you, I know that this book comes from your PhD research, so maybe just tell us how this all started, how it all began.
Well, okay, thank you. And I'll just, before I start, thank you to the Horror SIG for allowing me to launch my book. Oh, there it is, look. To launch my book tonight. Where did the idea come from? Well, basically, in about 2012, 2013, I was flicking through the TV channels really late one night, and I wasn't really paying attention, and I was going up and down the channels, and I saw The Walking Dead on British terrestrial television for the first time, and I'd not seen it before. I think it was season 2. I was watching the finale of season 2, and I was like, what the fuck is this? What is this? Is this a zombie film that I've not seen? And I was really confused. I didn't know what it was. So I was looking at my phone, what is this? Walking Dead? I didn't even knew nothing of it. And I just ended up watching the whole thing, watched the whole episode. And I was like, gosh, that's a bit strong for telly, because everyone was being eaten. The barn was on fire. It was chaos. And it was like, this is fantastic. What is this? And then about a month later, I was at a friend's house after the pub, and she was watching American Horror Story, and that was the 2nd season of American Horror Story, and it was the episode of Asylum when there's a big storm, and then some of them escape, and there's a mad doctor, and then there was zombies outside, and I was like, and this is on TV as well, what is this? So it came from me just stumbling across these 2 programs and wondering why and how are these things on TV, because all of the horror content that I was consuming then was film, really. I'd watched Buffy, and I'd seen some True Blood, and I'd seen bits and bobs of TV horror, but I'd never seen anything like this. So I was thinking, well, I would like to investigate this more. So it turned into my PhD sort of thesis proposal abstract. And I thought, well, from reading around it, all the psychoanalytical side, the social side, the political commentary, all of that reading analysis into these TV shows in that way was being done, and being done very well. But no one was really looking at this from an industrial perspective. So I was thinking, because my first question was to myself as I found The Walking Dead by accident was, how is this on telly? It was that question that spawned the rest of the project and became a PhD. A PhD, I did 3 case studies, just The Walking Dead, Hemlock Grove on Netflix, and Scream Queens on Fox. Huge detail for a PhD, and then I expanded it to cover the full decade of 2010 to 2020/2021 for the book. But yeah, it all came from those 2 nights of going, what is this? Why is it on TV? How has this come to pass?
So yeah, that was like one of the things that I think really sets apart the work that you're doing is, as you said, you're not doing the kind of close textual analysis of the content of these series, but how the kind of industrial conditions, what was there to kind of make this happen at this time. So I guess, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of fellow academics here. So how do you go about doing that? What were some of the places that you started to kind of get to begin your research, and what are some of the kind of interesting things that you found out by taking this route?
So it's well, like lots of research, I suppose, it's no different in the sense that it's a lot of putting together of a puzzle and finding all these disparate pieces of information and to try and figure out how a certain channel or a service has got into the configuration that it is. So a good chunk of my research was looking at the trade and entertainment press. So looking at Variety and Entertainment Weekly and The Atlantic and The Hollywood Reporter and all those things, because particularly in the States, channel executives, channel CEOs, producers or showrunners, they're very chatty with the press and they give out a lot of information. And they're much more, I guess, open, I think, than we are in the UK about their strategies and what the channel wants to do and how it's going to do it. And all that information is freely there. But I was finding with lots of things that a lot of it is sort of PR spin on things. So maybe they've developed a strategy and it's not come off as they thought. So now they're spinning it as something else. And a lot of it is so piecing all these disparate bits of information together and reading between the lines and thinking, well, the channel is standing for this, the executive's saying that, the showrunner's saying the other thing, and then the horror product looks like this. So how piecing all of those things together to get the story of how something came to be, how Hannibal came to be on NBC, why Scream Queens was where it was, why Stars did Ash vs Evil Dead, and then what those processes have on the end product. It's a big puzzle, and trying to wade through a lot of CEO speak because there's a lot of that, lots of talk of strategies and game changers and things, and I think I spent a lot of time going, what are you talking about? Just having to pick apart what they were actually saying. A lot of reading between the lines, I think, is going on for sure with all of what the channel execs are saying, particularly, like I said, when it goes wrong, when a program doesn't do very well and they panic.
And I think also a lot of what you're doing kind of intersects with a lot of what's been done, I guess, with television theory and media theory, starting from like the late 90s, this, the boom in cable television, the shift, to what people sometimes call complex television or quality television. So it's interesting because I guess that started around the 90s, but really the horror boom or cycles that you talk about don't really start until around 2010. So if you could just give us an idea of what the state of horror television was before 2010. It was,
well, and I'm sure Stacey Abbott can join in a little bit with this. Horror on TV, it was there, but it was a hidden or masquerading in other things, or it was there, it was very suggestive. So there was, you get horrifying sequences on, say, the X-Files, but it was kind of buried in this telefantasy sci-fi box. Or you'd get like police procedurals or medical procedural dramas where you'd have a body on an autopsy table and the body's open and gory and nasty, and you get a fleeting shot of it, but it's kind of cushioned in this safe veneer of medical procedure. There was bits and bobs of horror sort of shuffling around every now and then, like so it was Masters of Horror was over on Showtime, True Blood was on HBO, but they were the premium channels, so horror was locked away behind this, essentially behind a paywall, really. So there was horror existing, but it was hidden or cushioned by something else. So, you know, Buffy, a wonderfully smart, incredible, witty series with bits of horror in there, but how much do people watch it for the horror? I don't know. Again, ask Stacey. And then we roll around to 2010, and an awful lot of things between 2000 and 2010 on US television has happened. Has essentially just kicked TV into overdrive. So we've got mass audience fragmentation because there's a million channels, loads of cable channels. The internet is in everybody's houses. TV is suddenly incredibly busy, incredibly competitive. Netflix has arrived and put a rocket up the arse of the rest of TV. They're all in a panic. They think we're all going to leave them. So genre becomes a tool to keep people interested or to remind people that you're a TV channel in the first place. And then once horror got going in the 2010s, horror provided a big audience base, an audience base in the demographic that was needed, and crucially, a really loyal audience base. Horror fans are horror fans forever. Like, you know, we're still watching The Walking Dead, for instance, and it's been on for 150 years, but we're still watching it and we're still excited by it. So the fans are there, and TV could utilize this fan practice and sort of exploit it to a degree. There's also external things as well going on. So with other genres, science fiction genres, fantasy genres on TV, they became more viable because production practices changed, technology got better, CGI got better and cheaper. The viewing practices, the viewing apparatus at home, people got widescreen HD TVs, so it was worth making something as visually beautiful as, say, Game of Thrones or something like that, because it wasn't worth doing it on a tiny black and white TV, but now it suddenly was. So there was lots of things that slotted into place in terms of industry production practices, in terms of technology, what the channels were having to do because the audience was so spread around these days. The internet was causing competition. So lots of things just locked in and just sort of opened the door for The Walking Dead to arrive. And AMC wanted to do that because they were trying to challenge HBO. That's what lots of the channels were doing. Like you mentioned quality drama before, there was a tension between horror and quality drama because horror was seen as a bit trashy, as a bit shitty. Can we make that fit with quality? And when AMC said, oh, we're going to make The Walking Dead, and everyone, all the critics, so back to the trade press, they all said, well, where are you going to put The Walking Dead next to Breaking Bad and Mad Men? How's that going to work? What are you doing? And it didn't make sense to anyone. And then they launched it and it did incredibly well. So many, the viewing figures were off the chart. The amount of money they made on advertising basically made the rest of TV go, people want to watch this, do they? There's an audience, great. And they all jumped on.
So how do you think, or why do you think it was The Walking Dead? So in your book, you talk about The Walking Dead as kind of the trailblazer hit. What were some of the ways that it overcame those perceived problems with horror on television? I mean, you talk in the book about, this whole idea that, what horror is all about, the visual representation, the gore and effects, you can't do that on television. So what was, how did The Walking Dead overcome all of those, I guess, prejudices that people had about horror as well?
Definitely prejudices, weren't there? Because it was, there was always the problem of where do you put horror in the schedule? Where do we fit this in? And then, like you said, the visual representations of horror. So when AMC announced they were going to do The Walking Dead, and they went to Comic Cons to promote that they were going to do The Walking Dead, one of the things that came up in all the Comic Con panels was, don't worry, fans, we are going to have as much gore and blood and guts and zombie kills as you're expecting from a very violent and gory comic. And the way that AMC very cleverly, I think, went about this is they used their technical excellence, I call it in the book. They used it for promotional purposes. So rather than just having all of the gore and the zombies sitting inside The Walking Dead for you to find when you watch it, they almost like pulled back the curtain and showed people how they were doing it. So there was countless articles in the entertainment and trade press, so in Variety and Entertainment Weekly and The Atlantic and those places, interviews with Greg Nicotero and his team, with them talking through how they'd done that week's hero zombie. So there'd always be one zombie that would be, or walker, I guess, that would have the focus that week. whether it be the one that's stuck between two trucks or one that's grown into a tree or whatever, and they'd show you exactly how it was done step by step. And in Isabel Pinedo's book, 1994, 92, in her recreational terror book, and she talks about the rupture in the realism and horror fans looking to either see where something is fake or pretend that it's completely real. With The Walking Dead, they used pointing to where it becomes fake, where the prosthetic is, where they swap out the, you know, the actor's head for the dummy head to chop it off. And, you know, by going through all that in the trade press, it alleviates that tension between the very visual, gory, grim representations of horror that usually was struggling to find fit on TV. So they took that skill, which is sort of quite horror fan connoisseur skill, like there's magazines dedicated to it, but just for those that are particularly nerdy. So they took that skill and used it as promotion and said, look how great our team is, come and watch our horror program. And it worked for AMC and The Walking Dead very, very well. There was only a couple of other shows that tried to do something similar. I think American Horror Story did it with Freak Show when they had Sarah Paulson play the conjoined twins. So there was some stuff in the trade press about how they did that, but nobody really went for the look at our technical excellence as much as The Walking Dead did. And it just sort of, it broke that tension a little bit, well, a lot, between TV and gory zombies.
It's just suddenly occurred to me, it's quite interesting about how Greg Nicotero was centered, because if you think about, you know, around with the rise of quality television, you had the rise of the showrunner and this idea of the television auteur.
Yeah.
I guess with Walking Dead is interesting in that, of course, you had Frank Darabont, but then he left after the first season.
Yeah.
So it almost seems like Nicotero is kind of one of the central figures. I just suddenly occurred to me, it's just kind of, I can't think of any other instance where someone like in that kind of what is usually seen more as a peripheral role, becomes almost like a spokesperson for the show.
He's carried it in that sense for a long time, and his I guess his sort of standing in TV horror that he's sort of carved out for himself via The Walking Dead was used again when AMC launched Shudder and they did the Creep Show over on Shudder. They leaned back again on Nicotero, you know, by linking his name to it, because of course he was involved and he did loads of the effects, but in the promotion for that it was all about him again. So he's carved out a very nice little place for himself on TV, and, you know, fair play to him. I guess.
All right, I think now might be a really good time to bring in Stacey and Shellie if they can magically appear on screen. I didn't do your bio, Stella. Do you want me to read it out now? But yeah, we've got Stacey and Shellie. So Stacey is the OG, the legend, Stacey Abbott. She's a professor of film and television. She's a leading horror scholar who specializes in vampire and zombie in film and television, particular interest in the reimagining of the genre as it moves across media. So she's the author of Celluloid Vampires, Angel TV Milestone, Undead Apocalypse, Vampires and Zombies in the 21st Century, and the BFI film classic On Near Dark. And she's also co-author with Lorna Jowett of TV Horror and editor of Global TV Horror. And they're currently co-writing the third in their unofficial trilogy, which is Women Creators of TV Horror. And she's also researching a book on animation and horror. Then we have Shellie McMurdo, who's a lecturer in film and TV at the University of Hertfordshire, author of Blood on the Lens, Trauma and Anxiety in American Found Footage Horror Cinema, and a Devil's Advocate edition on Pet Sematary, both forthcoming, so should be out this year. And she's currently working on a research project with Laura Mee on the use of analog forms in contemporary horror cinema, and is also published on American Horror Story and True Crime Fandoms, Blumhouse Productions, and post-peak torture horror. So thank you both. All right, so we've mentioned already, Stacey, about some of the work that you've done. I was just wondering if you could also talk about why you think, you know, from the 2010s that there was this horror boom and what the state of horror was beforehand, and are there any kind of, I guess, key TV series that you think have kind of still have an influence today?
Right. Well, let's see. First of all, I think I just want to congratulate Stella on an outstanding book. And I think it's really, really going to be so vitally important for the future of this subject. And I think there's so much to talk about. I suppose, I mean, Stella rightly identifies The Walking Dead as this kind of moment where everything starts to change. And with my kind of historian mind on it, as someone who was writing about horror, what was really interesting was that when Lorna and I decided to do the TV horror book, which had grown out of like endless conference conversations where we would talk about all the stuff that we've been watching, say, well, it's horror on TV. In a way, having a similar kind of moment to Stella, where we were looking at stuff that, as Stella says, was masking itself as something else. You know, whether it was teen drama, science fiction, soap opera, whatever, but it's really horror. But it's really horror. Like, actually, come on. Like, it's, you know, we've got bodies, we've got this, it's transgressive, it's blurring lines of all kinds of stuff. So we were kind of having those conversations and wanted to go back and track that kind of where's this coming from? And ironically, you know, we wrote the book and like to think we were ahead of the game because we're finishing it just when The Walking Dead aired and managed to squeak the first season in to like, oh, there's this thing. So in a way, you know, it's just, so for us, it was about this saying there's this real legacy of horror at different points that are shows where they're showing there's an audience for this stuff. They're really interested, and it's the networks that are really cautious about it. There are networks who are really uncomfortable with this idea, and yet audiences are kind of watching it. So people talk about, and I'm going to mention your favorite Twin Peaks. I mean, Twin Peaks to me is absolutely crucial to any of this discussion as something that said, look, this is horror is on TV. So what people talk about with that, yes, we talk about the comedy and we talk about the soap opera, but those memorable moments are, you know, the most horrific. It's the pulling of the letter out from underneath Laura's fingernail. You know, it's just cringing in close-up detail. And it's Maddie's death, you know, which is brutal. And there's so much of this. So I think that what you get are these kind of moments where you can say, there's this interest, but it's like at that point, particularly with Twin Peaks, it's like the networks don't know what to do with this. They don't know how to market it. They don't know how. They're giving poor advice or, you know, or instructions to the creators in Twin Peaks to say, solve this. We can't keep drawing this narrative out, and that fault, you know, is a disaster, you know, for some audiences. So there's that kind of thing where the networks don't know what to do. But what I think is interesting when you go back in time, and it's like horror has cycles, because I think the key corollary, I would say, to what we're seeing, what Stella is talking about now, is really the 1970s. With the 1970s, American television were like going, yeah, no, do it all. Now, obviously, when you compare it to today, it still looks comparatively tame, but they are making horror. They are not pretending it's something else. You know, you've got TV movies, some of my favorites from my childhood, The Curse of the Black Widow Spider, and, you know, I love that film. You know, and they're so I think what we see is cycles of television recognizing that it's a boon, and then a retracting of it, and cautiousness as networks change. And we can think a lot about that, and I don't want to hog the conversation, but I think the ways in which the nature of the industry changes, so that shift from network to cable to etc., they're experimenting with different models, and sometimes they some things take, some things don't. So I always say Twin Peaks is really important. It wasn't a commercial success. It lasted 2 seasons, but I don't think anything would have happened if you didn't have Twin Peaks. You know, Buffy happens because of Twin Peaks. The X-Files happens because of Twin Peaks, and all of that is really laying the ground for what starts happening in 2010. That's my little speech.
So yeah, I didn't bring Twin Peaks up. Stacey brought it up, but yes, thank you. All right, Shellie. So you've done a lot of your research has been on found footage cinema, but I think what is also really interesting about this, you know, the past decade or so of horror television is that it's always crossing over with film. And like, again, going back to Twin Peaks, that was the whole thing with the most recent season. Is it a film or is it television? I also think about, you've got, Ash versus Evil Dead, The Exorcist, The Purge, Chucky, Scream. I Know What You Did Last Summer, The Mist. Let's go on. So I was just wondering if you kind of have any, I guess, the changes in television. I mean, are the boundaries between film and television, have they're completely broken down, or how does that affect kind of contemporary horror?
I mean, I want to say first, congratulations to Stella. I've been friends with Stella since 2000 and something, and yeah, to see her work finally getting out there in a whole ass book is really, really like thrilling to me. With your question, yeah, I mean, I was reading a thing the other day. I mean, at the moment, obviously, repping Stranger Things is on everyone's kind of minds at the moment. I was reading an article in The Guardian, which of course is known for kind of knee-jerk, reactionary, unpopular, edgy opinions. And they were saying, is Stranger Things, is it even still TV anymore? And it's like, I mean, I do feel like a bit of a pretender on this panel because, with Stacey and yourself and Stella, and my stuff is much more film-based. But I think, I was talking to Laura about this earlier, and it's kind of like, I guess I grew up in the 90s. Like, I think it's interesting that Stacey brought up, her formative experiences with horror being on television. So were mine. Like, Erie, Indiana was my kind of gateway drug to horror. But in the 90s, if we look back, from the 90s to the 50s, the way that television was in the 50s was kind of alien to us in the 90s. Just as television in the 90s is kind of increasingly alien, the way it was, an episode every week is increasingly alien to us now. Like, I had a student a couple of years ago that said, oh my God, WandaVision, they're doing this brand new thing where they're releasing it once a week. It's so cool. Like, you have to wait for an episode, and it's like, oh, my sweet summer child. This is the way we've always watched television before. Yes and no, I think. Like, to me, Stranger Things is still very much television. Like, that's the way I kind of, I guess it comes down to the way you consume it. I've never really been a binge watcher, so I still do like have breaks in between watching episodes. I mean, the last episode, it being 2.5 hours almost, was insane. I think it's interesting how we used to kind of, in the early days of HBO, not the early days, but like the early 2000s HBO, it was very much a compliment, a backhanded compliment to say, oh, this television show is so cinematic. And now that's almost like a complaint or like an insult, like, oh no, it's too much like film now. We want to go back to some sweet spot in between where it's still television, but it's got the production values of cinema, maybe. So yeah, I think they're definitely coming more and more together. Yeah, maybe it's down to consumption. I don't know.
I was wondering, Shellie, what you thought of, because over the course of doing my PhD and then expanding it, I could see across the years as I was writing it that there was various showrunners, producers, or whatever they want to call themselves, who knows, they'd say things like, oh, well, yeah, it is violent, but it's not Saw, it's not that bad, it's not torture porn, so you're all right. And it was like, well, it is pretty fucking violent, like, what you're doing. And then 5 years later, oh right, now you are doing a slasher, and it's like, what? So what Stacey was saying, like, the TV's saying something and then they pull back and then they go back in, and it's like this constant coming in and out of horror over time. And I feel like that TV horror in the States has done quite a lot, like ticked off quite a few horror subgenres. We've had a slasher, we've had werewolves, and we've had this and we've had the other. And I was wondering what you thought, as the queen of found footage, if that could be serialized, because you get flashes of it in things like in American Horror Story, Roanoke, the one that we don't talk about, but just but like do you think, because we would have said at one point, oh well, you probably can't serialize a slasher, but here we are, and there's a few on the telly. But what about found footage? Do you think it could be serialized? And are you going to make one?
I'm definitely not going to make one. I think it's like the torture porn thing, because I remember, because I don't hit me, but I stopped watching The Walking Dead.
All right, get out.
You're no longer my friend. But I remember, like, when Glenn, I guess it's not a spoiler now because it was years ago, when Glenn died, there was an article, I think it was in Variety, might have been Variety, might have been something else, that said, oh, you know, that episode was just torture porn.
Yeah.
And it was like, I thought that was really interesting, how they were kind of, you know, it's just torture porn, not, oh, it's torture porn, it's just torture porn. In terms of found footage, I think it's, yeah, Roanoke, that wasn't amazing. I don't know if that was because of the found footage element or because it was just a poor season.
Yeah.
Because some American Horror Story, I mean, I'm sure everyone has like American Horror Story seasons that they love and ones that they hate. Like my favorite's Hotel. I know a lot of people that's their least favorite. Roanoke was definitely my least favorite. Don't know how much of that had to do with the found footage element of it, but like The River, that was an intriguing kind of little series that happened, but it was very much like a found footage horror adjacent. Like you said, there was kind of elements of it, but it wasn't a full-on found footage series. I think it would work if you had something like a true crime framing. So a movie, which as soon as I said true crime, I knew your face was going to light up. Something like, if anyone's seen the film Savage Land or the Poughkeepsie tapes, I think that would, something like that would work if you kind of did a framing of it as like, oh, this is a true crime documentary, a true crime series, or maybe a kind of, you know, we found these tapes and each week we're going to show you one of these tapes, so it has kind of a framing device around it. I mean, on YouTube you've kind of seen serialized found footage horror. I mean, I think Aaron just mentioned in the chat Marble Hornets from like 2009 to 2014, I think it was, did that really, really well. But I think that works because of the YouTube medium. It's like, that makes sense that someone would have found footage and uploaded it.
Yeah.
Whereas on a TV, it's like, what, they found it, then they contacted the network, then they scheduled a time for it to be on. Do you know what I mean? It's like on YouTube that just works a little bit better. But I think with a framing device, it could work. I'd love for it to work. I want my book to come out first, so then I don't have to talk about it, but then it can work.
It also makes me think of, I mean, Shellie, you've also done a lot of things to do with social media, and I think about one of my favorite TV horror series of the past few years is based on creepypasta, which is Channel Zero. Yeah. So I was just wondering, I mean, I guess we've talked a lot about, you know, the rise of the internet and new media, and that changes the way we view films. But yeah, I think it also can maybe change the content and the form of horror television. I don't know what my question is there. I don't know. Shellie, just in terms of your work on social media, I mean, how much do you think social media can play a part in keeping TV horror going?
I think, I mean, going back to Marble Hornets, that was, I mean, I remember when that was kind of unfolding at the time, and you had the Twitter going along at the same time and various characters having Twitters and stuff. That worked really, really well. And I think that's something that has been adopted more widely by television. So I think, I didn't watch Lost, but I think Lost had like social media stuff. That would be an interesting way of keeping it going, or that kind of transmedial spreading the narrative across various stuff. That would work too. So, you know, a series and a Twitter account and a YouTube channel, maybe that would work. The most recent thing that I've seen that is kind of trying to do that is a podcast called Video Palace, that is a kind of self-contained podcast, but then they released a book that kind of ties into a lot of the stuff that happens in the podcast, but on a separate kind of medium. So yeah, I think that would work if you kind of spread it a little.
Yeah.
Sorry, go. Stella, have you got something?
No, just saying, I'm in. It sounds good. You write it, I'll watch it.
Don't make me write it, thanks.
And I thought I'd bring Stacey back in, because I think another thing I mentioned before, how there is these crossovers between film and television franchises happening. I've got Ash versus Evil Dead and Chucky and so forth, but also this process of adaptation. Like I was thinking of also like Penny Dreadful, which I really loved, taking older kind of horror stories and kind of updating them. And of course, I think of The Haunting of Hill House, and a lot of, I mean, we should probably talk about Mike Flanagan as well as this really kind of important force of of kind of really doing interesting things with television horror.
Yeah, I mean, so many thoughts there. I'm going to pick up on the last thing there and then go backwards. But Mike Flanagan, I think, is important for a number of things, partly because I think he does highlight that blurring of cinema and television, because he works regularly between the two. But I think he also highlights the difference between them, in the sense that he is someone who is very aware about how to make a film for cinema, and when he does sort of Dr. Sleep or other films or standalone narratives, he does that really well. But he then thinks about how to not just adapt long running stories, but how to think about structuring stories across multiple episodes. And one of the key things about television, and whatever medium we're looking at it, when I talk to people about television, I say I use that term in the broadest way, and what I'm really thinking about is serialized extended storytelling in an audiovisual media, and that's, I think, really important. So Flanagan's been doing some really interesting things with The Haunting of Hill House, The Haunting of Bly Manor, and Midnight Mass, which is my absolute favorite at the moment. And I love all of his work, but I Midnight Mass is my obsession. But I think and going back to your point about adaptation, what's really interesting with him, and I know it's really controversial, there are people who love his work and hate it, because he recognizes in adapting something to television or to whatever format is you're not doing the book. You are now, you can't just do the book. You are now turning it into something for a different media, and you're turning into something for a 10-part serial. So he uses that thing of starting with the book and thinking, okay, but how do I tell the story? And what am I trying to tell? So I think he is very playful with adaptation, and is no longer slavish, because let's be honest, if you want to read The Haunting of Hill House, if you want that, read the book. Even the film, The Haunting, which is a masterpiece, it's still different from the book. It's still its own thing. It is a piece of cinema. And I think with what he does on the series is really kind of get us to engage with character in a very different way. And one of the things I think for me that so many of these texts do, that's so important to horror on television, is inviting us to engage with characters in a very emotional way, so that as these things happen to them, we are invested. And whether it's The Walking Dead or The Haunting of Hill House or Midnight Mass. So I think that's really important to me. I think with what I think is going on with Mike Flanagan, he really understands that. And he understands about investing in these characters. And one of the things, it's a sort of running joke with Simon Brown and I about Stephen King, etc. And one of the things when I was watching The Haunting of Hill House, I kept saying, this isn't actually The Haunting. This is it. This is it. He's adapting it with a different text, because you're telling the story of what happens to children and what happens to their grown-up versions interconnected, which when people adapted it, both in the 90s and in the film, said you have to keep those two characters separate. You can't integrate them. And like the novel does. So the novel has you constantly going back and forth. And you're watching The Haunting of Hill House and saying, no, what works is the fact that you care about the adults, because you're completely invested in the kids and the adults simultaneously. And through that, we feel the horror. Through that, we feel. So we don't just, yes, we like our jump scares and we like our gore, but we also, need to care. And I say that goes to The Walking Dead, the bit with Glenn, which was horrible. And going back to the point Shellie made, that was the moment. Now people only compared it to Saw. It was the moment where everyone said, has The Walking Dead gone too far? Mm-hmm. Have they gone too far? I was on the radio, BBC Wales, defending it for saying, why is this too far? Yeah, all these other people died. It was fine. But it's because people were so invested in him. And it was so brutally graphic that people, it was too much. Yeah. So I think these are really important. That it's really important that's what television really does in such a great way, and why I think The Walking Dead is so important. Stella, did you want to jump in here with your enthusiasm for that moment?
Yeah, it's because it could, well, like exactly what you said with Glenn, we all loved him very much. We loved him dearly, and it was it was that thing, The Walking Dead has gone too far, and Greg Nicotero and Galen Hurd, they had to like they had to be on the phone to the press the next day, essentially a phone press conference to explain themselves, like they were, you know, naughty kids that were getting their wrist slapped, and it's like, and people were complaining, and it's like, that's what's bothering you, because the thing, because like when I watched it, of course, I was bawling my eyes out, as you would expect, but that wasn't a scene that I found to be a bit, oh, that's a bit strong. It was in the opening season of episode 5, where they're in Terminus and they're all over that trough, and they're with their heads bashed, and they're going down the line, they're smacking the back of their head, slitting their throat, and then they drop over and they're going down the line. And that scene I found really strong and, you know, and powerful. And I was like, and then I think that later on in season 5, when Rick hacks Gareth to death with a machete, and Rick's doing it, he's doing it to camera, like he's doing it like it's to you, and it's so violent, and he's hacking and hacking and hacking and hacking. It goes on and on and on, and I'm like, well, yeah, we loved Glenn, and Abraham was funny and all that kind of stuff, but it was like, I don't know, I didn't quite understand the outpouring of outrage that came from it. I was like, this is 7 years now where it's been pretty relentless.
Yeah.
Come on, it's fine.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I completely agree. And I found that equally just kind of perplexing, you know, and the focus on Glenn, because I, like you, I was crying throughout that. And I still remember watching that episode when I watched it first thing in the morning, because they'd been simultaneously broadcast over here. And I didn't watch it at 2 in the morning. I waited, got up, and watched it before I went to work. And I remember going to work on the bus, just in shock and just like emotionally drained. And for me, it wasn't the Glenn bit, which was horrible, but, you know, one among many. What for me, it was the breaking of Rick. Actually, that episode was about breaking Rick, and you're watching someone and not being physically tortured, but basically their will broken down. And I remember just feeling, but I just couldn't get over why people would suddenly say, oh, that's too far, because I came away as emotionally overwrought as I and that's why I love The Walking Dead, because it can make you feel this way, and you really, really feel that this is the perils of power and people fighting for power and what they will do. So it was and so you'll be pleased I defended it vociferously against people trying to say, oh, you know, it's not like Psycho, to which I said, and Psycho was hugely controversial when Psycho came out, because everyone said, oh, that Hitchcock's gone too far. So, you know, that argument is very thin. So I think there's something really powerful about the televisual form and how it kind of engages us, which I don't know how that relates to your original question, Lindsay, but we've gone in an interesting tangent.
Well, it makes me think now, I guess, what a lot of Shelley's work goes into, which is this whole idea of trauma. And it's interesting to think about the long form storytelling and how you can really show that process, that trauma, and how it keeps reverberating, and how you keep going back to that original traumatic moment. And it also, and I think across horror in general now, I think this notion of trauma is something that's so many film and TV shows are thinking about. I mean, recently we just had our symposium on Yellow Jackets. That Yellow Jackets is all about, you know, this event that happened when they were younger, and how it, you know, it's almost like they can never return from being stuck on that in the wilderness. And I mentioned, you know, I think Midnight Mass is so much about that. There was a show on Apple called Lisey's Story, a Stephen King adaptation, which I think was very much about that. I guess maybe people's thoughts. I mean, maybe Shellie, because this is kind of your area. How the long form and dealing with trauma.
Yeah. I just wanted to bounce off something that Stacey said about you know, when people said this has gone too far. And I think me and Stella have had a conversation before. It's like, what did you think was going to happen? Like, what did you sign up for? This is a show about zombies. Like, that was always like really just strange to me. Like, what did you think was going to happen? With trauma, I think, yeah, like Yellow Jackets, like you said, is probably one of the recently like the most clear cut, this is a show about trauma that we've had for a while. I mean, Twin Peaks, that's about trauma. Haunting of Hill House is about trauma. Midnight Mass is definitely about trauma. A lot of the separate episodes of American Horror Story about trauma. I think the thing that television has over film in that respect is time. It's getting to know those characters and really care about them and care about what's happened to them. And also, like, I think one of the reasons I love Mike Flanagan so much is how much detail he puts into things, including the detail in people's trauma and like tiny little things that he just hints at. And then, you know, you get the millions of Reddit threads on, do you think that look to that person meant this? And like, do you think they were remembering this at this point? So yeah, I think that the thing that television has over film in that respect is definitely the space to like develop these characters and make you care about them and make you care about what happened to them as well.
And I guess it's the whole thing of like trauma is not like, oh, suddenly I'm over it now. Just this thing happens and then that's it. It's like, it never.
We talked about it. I'm fine now.
Yeah.
I think Yellow Jackets is so good with that. Yellow Jackets is like, I mean, if people haven't seen Yellow Jackets already, you must, like, it's so good.
Yeah. And we've been talking a lot about Mike Flanagan, and he kind of seems to be getting, you know, Netflix are kind of giving him free run. So Stella, back to you. When we talked about, you know, The Walking Dead and coming from cable television, and cable television was what really kicked off, you know, this kind of what people talked about, this new golden age or shift in television. But then we need to really talk about streaming and Netflix. And I guess Netflix is kind of the first main streaming service. I guess was the first horror TV show on Netflix, was it Hemlock Grove?
It was.
We could talk about like how Netflix kind of changed everything and streaming.
Yeah, so Netflix was, well, can we still call them? They were kind of the new kid on the block, weren't they, for a bit? And in what usually happens in TV studies, there'll be something that'll turn up that'll be heralded as this is the death of television, and then it turns out it's not, and it's fine, and everyone can calm down. With Netflix, they were doing their mail order thing, and then the bandwidth finally allowed them to do the streaming thing, and then they having a license to lots of stuff, and then they did Lilyhammer, and then they did House of Cards. And Netflix's method is very what's the word, like quite clinical in terms of how they figure out what they want to do next. I mean, sometimes people take things to them and pitch it to them, but when Netflix decide, okay, we want to make a whatever it is, they will look at all their data, because they're all about the data. Not that they release very much, but they're all about the data. So they use the data as a I guess a puzzle to put together to figure out what will work. So with House of Cards, they were like, right, loads of people have rented the BBC version of House of Cards. Loads of people watch David Fincher stuff, and loads of people watch stuff with Kevin Spacey in it before we found out he was a wrong'un. And so they put all that together and like, right, well, let's do this then. So with Hemlock Grove, it was 2013. Walking Dead's been on air for 3 years. American Horror Story's been on air for 2 years. Walking Dead is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, going from strength to strength. Netflix like, right, next we're going to do another series, let's do a horror, because that's the thing. So they approach Eli Roth. They go to him because on their horror index, Eli Roth is really high because everyone's watching Hostel still. So they formulate it and put it together. And because Netflix they'd said very publicly and very explicitly, we want to be HBO before HBO can become us. So HBO didn't have a streaming option at that stage. So Netflix were like, oh, we're going to be bigger and badder. So they were like, we're going to make a gothic vampire drama, clearly mirroring it off True Blood. They even had Skarsgård's brother play one of the vampires. It was all very incestuous in that sense. And they just sort of built it around their data. And the reason why Hemlock Grove, well, I don't know, you can like whatever you like, it's up to you, but Hemlock Grove was very messy in that it tried to be all things to all people. So it had the teenage supernatural kind of Buffy-esque stuff going on. It had the drama that was for slightly older women with a powerful matriarch sexy character, and then it had all the horror elements as well, werewolves and vampires and shapeshifters, you know, and all this stuff going on. And it was like, what is this? What am I watching? It was very confusing. So it was trying to be too many things to too many people whilst not actually doing very much at the same time. So I don't know. Well, Shellie said, you know, you must watch Yellow Jackets. Must you watch Hemlock Grove? probably not. Probably give it a miss. But Netflix were using it as one of their foundations into getting into making their own long form serialized big storytelling dramas. And as you know, it was their second real sort of step in, because Lilyhammer was a co-production. And just, you know, it was just another testament to how important horror was in those early years of the cycle, that everyone jumped on it. And for Netflix's second go at doing a series, they did a horror. How good it was is kind of neither here nor there.
I seem to remember you doing a really interesting paper at Fear 2000s a few years ago now, I think, and you were talking about how, well, one thing that Netflix seems like they're not really very forthcoming. You mentioned before about lots of CEOs, they talk to the press. Netflix are like they kind of don't talk about, you know, all the data that they're using. But I also remember you mentioning about how like algorithms and how what you saw of Hemlock Grove and how it was sold to each people almost, because I think I remember you saying that there was the appeal to older female audiences in some way. And so if you could just talk about that, like what are Netflix doing?
What the hell
How
are
are they
they
getting
doing?
in our brains?
We're still trying to figure it out. They're very, so other channel CEOs, they've just got constant verbal diarrhea of talking about what they're doing and how they're going to do it and how amazing it's going to be, and it's constant, and they won't shut up. Netflix make these big broad claims and they don't back it up with any data, because legally, I think that's changed now. So for instance, say with Fox or NBC, they've got Nielsen data that anybody can go and look at. It's freely available data, and Netflix are like, yeah, this show's really popular. We just have to take their word for it. Like, there's no proof. So Netflix created, with Hemlock Grove, they created a number of trailers, and so each trailer was for the same show, but each trailer contained these very distinct elements of the show. So they were for very distinct audience pools or subscriber pools at Netflix. So the trailer that might pop up on my Netflix for Hemlock Grove will be a different trailer to what Shellie might get, or to what you might get. And they were just going for all of these people. And the way that they did it inside the show was to shoehorn as many things into Hemlock Grove as they could, which is why the show made very little to no sense. So they have these, they tag everything, they call it genre tagging. So if you open your Netflix now, each show will have 3 or 4 words on it. So it might be like horror, suspenseful, strong female lead, or drama set in London. You know, sometimes it's really, really random. So everything is tagged with these 3 or 4 words, and that's one of the ways that they arrange their data. So if the words that are frequently coming up when you click on things that you want to watch, that tells Netflix which trailer they will give to you to bring you into Hemlock Grove. So some people might go and watch Hemlock Grove for the sexy vampires, some other people might go because of Eli Roth, some other people might go because of the female lead. You know, there's many reasons, but it's all done on how Netflix gathers the data and then how it tags all of its shows. And it still does it now, which is why, you know, your Netflix wall looks different to mine, and so on and so forth. And why it's really annoying when people in your house or your husband, they go on your Netflix and start watching some bloody sci-fi kung fu film that's buggered up all your algorithms, and then what you get suggested is bollocks from there on in. Maybe that's just in my house.
And I think it's kind of interesting again with the streaming services, how it's kind of culminated in now we've got Shudder, which is, you know, a purely horror streaming service. And to be honest, like, I think it's probably one of the streaming services that I watch the most now. Their original films the films that they acquire really are some really amazing stuff. So I mean, I guess just talk about like the significance of Shudder. Does that say that horror is here now? Horror is kind of taken over. Yeah,
it's significant to AMC. So AMC Networks own Shudder. So they have Shudder and is it called Sundance TV? I think they're the 2 sort of extra things that you can pay for from AMC. Shudder works, or rather its tactics is to go down the route of, this is where you find authentic, legitimate, for the horror fan horror. We have things over here on Shudder that you can't get anywhere else. So they run their monthly and sort of yearly plan on exclusives. So they'll have at least 1 exclusive a month, usually two to 4 exclusives a month, and you can't get those things on any other streaming platform. They do things where it's Shudder's main thing is to have, I'm sure they get a lot of subscribers for Halloween, but it's maintaining those subscribers for the rest of the year. So they start their Halloween rundown in August. They start counting it down, well, I guess in what, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, they'll start counting down to Halloween. And then they maintain that by having all these exclusives, by keeping the ball rolling throughout the year. They also kind of curate what they do. So it feels a lot like you're more engaging with like a horror film festival. It feels a lot like that sometimes, particularly with the stuff like at the drive-in with Joe Bob Briggs. It's very film festival-like, and it's sort of really pushing this, you know, if you're a real horror fan, then this is where you'll be, because we've got the exclusive stuff, we've got the more gory stuff, we've got the authentic things like Creepshow, and you know, they go that way with it. And it's that AMC networks think a whole channel that you have to pay an extra bill for is worth it. I think that's a really telling indictment, I guess, of where horror is, not just in terms of TV, but sort of horror fandom, horror film, what's going on with all of those things coming together that makes Shudder worthwhile. Because there's a couple of others. There's Screambox and Chiller. I think Chiller's still a thing, but they don't have near the content that Shudder does. But you know, it's AMC were, again, we can point back to the legacy of The Walking Dead, because they're using Greg Nicotero and his connections to that to promote Creepshow over on Shudder. When Creepshow launched on Shudder, the series, they showed a couple of episodes over on AMC to try and draw people over to Shudder with Greg Nicotero introducing it. So they're linking across the two, and it's their legacy, The Walking Dead legacy, showing AMC there's a huge audience for this, because The Walking Dead, I guess, can be mainstream horror now, whereas over on Shudder you've got all this stuff that is authentic and for the fans, and it's, you know, it's all part of the same trajectory, I would say, of what The Walking Dead kind of set off for television and for the content that people are prepared to pay for. I mean, I can't afford it at the moment.
No, that's also, yeah, because AMC did the history of horror, Eli Roth's history of horror, and that's on yes, of course, yeah, AMC and Shudder, yep. All right, we're coming around to 8 o'clock, so if people could start putting their questions in the chat, while people are formulating their questions, something that I wanted to ask about and that Stacey has put in the chat is about Shudder being very international. And I also think of Netflix as well. I mean, Squid Game, there's a lot of content from South Korea. There's also, you know, stuff from France, Germany, Japan, Australia. So I guess the idea of television and of streaming actually opening people up to television from around the world to watch a South Korean drama and for it to be so huge like Squid Game was. So I don't know if Stacey or Stella, if you want to kind of pick that up while people get their questions.
I'm happy to. Yeah, I mean, I think that obviously, again, when Lorna and I did the second book on global TV horror, you know, again, you go back, you start realizing, yeah, there's lots of traditions of horror, TV horror around the world, and a lot of these countries have their own legacies. But I think one of the key things is the fact that, you know, those like traditions, with the exception of American and maybe British television, which have a certain amount of, you know, even historically have more of an international appeal. But a lot of those other places, you know, those were local products. They didn't travel. And I think streaming has it's done two things. One, it's provided a space for these shows to be, so something you have access. But also because of the way people watch Netflix in particular, I think people who historically might not have watched international product have started watching them because they're there and they turn up. And if you, as Stella has eloquently argued, once you select one, you suddenly get loads. So my, you know, Netflix feed is filled with Korean TV drama because I've watched quite a few, and it just keeps getting more and more. And I think that's been really exciting, that suddenly you're bridging these gaps. And again, there's an industrial point, because Netflix doesn't do this, you know, to be altruistic. They're not trying to make us a more globally better world. You know, they fund or they support products in different countries because that allows them to get a foothold there and sell subscriptions in those countries. So, you know, you want Indian TV product on Netflix India, but then it can become available internationally. But I think it's been really good because I think it has reduced some boundaries. I think we have a lot more access. There's a lot more dialogue. So Squid Game is huge, but before Squid Game, there was The Kingdom. I mean, so now when you talk about The Walking Dead, I think we really need to be talking about Kingdom as well, because that is a huge show, both in South Korea and internationally. And then also had that thing of being kind of second season coming out at the beginning of COVID. So suddenly it's also very current, and yet doing something that's so different from what we see with The Walking Dead. And it furthers not only the cultural difference, but also that sense of saying, watching a zombie series they're all different, and they can be. So you can have a period drama that is all about class system in a way that's very different from this very contemporary American series that it's about kind of power and control and ideology that we see in The Walking Dead. So I think there's something quite exciting about the moment we're in. And that definitely Netflix, I think, has led the way. And I think of a lot of the streaming services, it's the one that I think I seem to be more aware that I think you were seeing a lot more of that international content. But I think Shudder completely recognizes that horror fans historically are even long before this move towards for audiences being more open to international, horror fans will follow the genre, and they will follow it wherever it goes. So if there's a good horror film that's coming out of Iran, they'll watch that and suddenly open up doors to that. And I think Shudder really recognized that, and it's really exciting to be able to have that so easily in a way that it wasn't in the past.
Stella, there's a focus in your book mostly on American television, but I don't know if you have kind of looked into, the fact of that there is this kind of more wider international scope with horror on streaming services in particular.
Yeah, I mean, from my own experience of my own consumption of horror, it's certainly easier for me to find more stuff, when something gets suggested to you by a friend or or colleagues, that it's easier to find stuff, and it just makes it so much more, I don't know, I guess easier is just the word. Like there's just so much more content out there, and there is the problem of, well, is there too much content? How we've got to sift through everything all the time because there is so much stuff. And then when something is a niche conglomeration like what Amanda Lotz calls it on things like Shudder, and it's all sort of nicely arranged for you, it's just easy to watch so much more. And with the Korean stuff, it's definitely having a moment, and I'm sure we can expect a flurry of papers and chapters on Korean zombies anytime soon. And it's just in terms of, because like you say, Netflix aren't doing it out of the goodness of their hearts. It's a business, and that sort of feeds back into why I wanted to look at industry, because if we're going to understand the product, we should understand the process and reasons for its manufacture. And it helps to then, if you do want to look at the deeper readings of whatever it is you're watching, if you understand how it's been made and why it's been made, it gives you that extra bit of knowledge, which I think is particularly useful. And long live these channels and services that do give us access to all this stuff, because otherwise I don't think I'll be able to cope. More and second season of All of Us Are Dead, please. That's what I want.
In fact, following on from this, there's a question from Kat saying, Stella, I know your research focuses mostly on the US, but I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how this recent wave of prestige TV horror has been positioned on British TV, whether original British horror on TV or US shows being shown on British TV. I'm just trying to think what the question is there. Am I reading it correct? Yeah, it seems maybe it's cut off. How is this being positioned on British TV?
Oh God, I mean, I'll be honest and say I don't. And this is a question that I asked my students, or I posed to my students, and I asked them, when you go home and watch TV tonight, are you going to watch BBC or are you going to flick on Netflix and watch something American? And most of the time they say something American. So I think I kind of fall into that trap as well. I don't really watch much British telly unless it's Bake Off, which isn't horror. But I think there's an interesting question with regards to this idea of quality. And so things like, if somebody says to you, you're talking about a new series and they say, oh, you know, it's kind of like HBO style, then you know what they mean, you know, the very glossy, cinematic, you know, it's become a common sense term, I think. And something through just being on HBO gives it this gloss of quality. It doesn't really matter what it is. So there was a similar thing that happened. It's not necessarily connected to British, but it can connect it to other countries. When Hannibal was on NBC and it wasn't doing particularly well, and they kept shifting it around the schedule and all that kind of stuff, and it was a co-production with another company, and the other company didn't really care that it wasn't getting much ratings, and NBC were fanning around with it, for want of a better term. They didn't care, because when they were selling it to other territories, they could say, it's been on NBC, it's been on American television, so it's got that sort of drive behind it of, well, this must be worth it, this must be good, because it was on NBC for so long. So I don't know if that kind of answers the question, but, you know, giving something this badge of prestige or quality because it's been on a certain channel, even if it didn't do particularly well there. So that's a thing, I think. Don't know.
I mean, I'm so thankful that we got 3 seasons of Hannibal, and it's one of the best. And I still love that Brian Fuller used to say, anyone directing an episode, he would tell them, you're direct it like you're directing a pretentious art movie. Yes, exactly. I can't believe it was on network television. All right, question from Laura for Stella. How did you decide what to include within the scope of horror TV? The talk about Stranger Things earlier made me think about genre hybridity and intended audiences, and the idea of shows that are horror adjacent or inspired by horror, while we might not immediately categorize them within the genre. What was yours?
Oh God. Well, I knew I wanted the structure to be, I want to talk about The Walking Dead first, because I'm making the point that The Walking Dead kicked off what I identified as the cycle. So I stuck with cable, and then I went over to video on demand and streaming services. So I did Netflix, Shudder, and then Stars and Showtime. And then I went over to free-to-air cable. So I organized it in terms of the tier or economic model of TV. And in terms of deciding what case studies to go on, I think I made some effort to not overlap the type of horror. So for instance, I talked about The Walking Dead. I didn't really talk about Fear the Walking Dead because they were quite close. I didn't bring in too much discussion about vampires. Sorry, Stacey. So I tried to just pick up enough of a range to cover the types of horror that were on there. But really, I think a lot of the choices that I made, I kind of took the liberty to choose the ones that I enjoyed watching. So I knew I was going to have to watch them over and over again. And there was a couple I was like, oh God, I'm not asked about that. Like the Sleepy Hollow series, for instance, I was like, yeah, I'm not bothered. So I didn't write about it. But so long as I had a decent coverage across each tier, then that's how I managed it. The only one, Laura, that I felt that I wasn't sure about including in the book, but then once I did, I was pleased that I did, was iZombie, because it's like it's quite gentle, it's quite nice, it's, you know, it's funny, and it was like, you know, it's got a zombie in it, and it's got a zombie in the title. Like how horror-y is this? But it meant that I could do a decent discussion of the CW, the channel, and what they do and what their aims are and why they would do something like iZombie and be gentle about it. But that was one that I was like, is this horror enough? But that's kind of, I don't know, the discussion that I could have with it. Is it worth including this? And yeah, it was.
Really, really interesting comment here from Aaron, and it relates back to what we were talking about with trauma. It's not a question, but just on trauma, another recent and extremely graphic series that properly dug into historical trauma and how historical and personal trauma might be in dialogue with each other is Them, which I personally thought was excellent for maybe a couple of episodes early on, the second and third maybe, when it was doing really interesting things with cultural gaslighting and racial othering, and kept messing with our understanding of who the them of the title was. But I'd fallen out with it long before the end. For anything interesting or provocative was ditched quite early on in favor of some less compelling narrative threads that retroactively sort of ruined that really interesting stuff from before. The second half of the series rarely felt like very much more than some fairly well-known white directors having a lot of fun depicting racial violence and historical atrocities to little meaningful end, but with enough gesturing towards Get Out to get away with it. That's a really, really interesting point, and that was something I was thinking about them, and also Lovecraft Country, which we're dealing with racism and you know, the Lovecraft Country in particular, I think was really interesting, and that it was, I think, also dealing with, you know, the legacy of someone like Lovecraft, who was terribly racist in his stories. And really, I mean, you know, I hate to say it, but I think horror genre and even horror fandom is quite overwhelmingly white, I have to say. And I think them, is also an interesting example, because like Aaron says, there was a lot of a backlash against that film, that it was just almost like trauma porn. I mean, there's not a question here, but maybe I will throw it to Shellie in terms of, I guess, dealing with historical trauma in television, because with Lovecraft Country, they kept referencing the Tulsa massacre of 1921. So I don't know if that's something, I guess, you're dealing with historical trauma within horror television.
I mean, I didn't watch any of them, so I can't kind of speak about that. But Lovecraft Country, which I always want to call it Lovecraft County. I don't know why. Like, my mouth just goes county, and I'm like, no, don't do that. Lovecraft Country I loved that show. I thought it was so good. And yeah, I think it was really interesting, you know, as an adaptation of kind of Lovecraft stuff, but also as an adaptation of the comic it was based on. And sort of navigating these two kind of different forms of adaptation and what to do with them, what to present to the audience and stuff. I think it was a super interesting program. The episode of that really affected me was the one where I can't remember Tick's sister's name in it, but where she wants to go to the funeral of...
That's D.
Oh, was it D? Of Emmett, you know, I can't remember if in the series it's explicitly Emmett Till's funeral.
It is.
But yeah, that episode really got me, and I think it was a very, I hate to say like for a horror show, but for a horror, it was very like quite sensitively done and very powerfully done. But them, I haven't watched that yet. But given what Aaron said, maybe I won't.
Stacey, if you want to come in there at all.
Well, I'll just agree. I think Lovecraft Country and them, again, I haven't finished them, so I have mixed feelings about it, but I'm working my way as I watch it. But with Lovecraft Country, I think it's a show that it's not without its problems, but I think it is trying to confront us with this idea and challenge the racism, as you said, inherent in Lovecraft, but also to open up a space to say that this genre should not be exclusive to white audiences, white creators, etc., and male, like, because it's also the showrunner is Misha Green, and a lot of the writers and directors on the show are women, and so there is a sense of trying to open up horror and to kind of think through different types of trauma. So it's dealing with racial trauma, but going back to Dee's character in the book was a boy. And they rewrote that character as a young woman to kind of explore a story that doesn't often get told, which is her confrontation with racism and violence and how she processes it and responds. So I think it's a very, as with any, and one thing I have to say when you're writing about television, I'm sure Stella agrees, often with long-running series, no show is perfect, you know, and, you know, they'll do really good things and they can do bad things. And there are things with Lovecraft Country that I think where they kind of miss the point, or they just fall into a trap of doing something else it's problematic in a different way. But I think that it was very exciting in terms of its storytelling, in terms of claiming horror and saying this you know, this can be done with not only Black characters in the narrative, but with very much an eye on an audience saying that there's a long history of Black, African American, or internationally Black audiences loving horror and wanting to be represented, and it's part of a big movement about trying to change horror in that respect. So I think there's something very effective about engaging with that kind of trauma.
Yeah. All right, we've got another question here for Stella. From Jonathan. It says, well done, Stella, for the great book. I can see there are some later chapters dedicated to Scream Queens. This reminded me of your earlier points about how horror tropes overlapped into other TV genres. There are also other horror-themed reality TV competition shows such as Face Off and Dragula. How much do these shows help to illustrate the arguments you're making about horror on TV? Or are they very different because they are reality TV competition series? Two very good shows.
Well, I've not seen either of them. So I don't know, but I guess I would muse on the idea of horror being so useful a tool now for TV that to integrate it into, you know, reality TV competition series, then it's kind of, I guess, proving my point, I guess, a little bit of the book, that horror has become so useful, so viable, so valuable to TV now that it might as well be used in these other different ways. Because, you know, why not? We horror audiences, we've proved to TV that we're here and we're loyal, and there's a lot of us, so, you know, bring it in for other things. So yeah, I've not watched them, but I will.
Face Off is really good. It's all special effects.
Yeah,
Wanting to be special effects people. Yeah.
all right, in my book.
All right, I think we've got time. We've got one last question here from Kate, who says, I'm really looking forward to reading your stuff on Ash versus Evil Dead in the book. I'm sure I read somewhere that Bruce Campbell said that Starz was the perfect place for the series because they allow them to do what they like and not water down the gore for television. Have I got that right? And what led to the series being axed? That's
absolutely right. So they, I used your stuff, Kate, that you'd written about Evil Dead. In fact, your little book's on the shelf behind me. In terms of talking about Bruce Campbell as the cult film star, and Ash versus Evil Dead being the cult of personality, and they pushed Ash. See, there we go. We can't separate Ash and Bruce Campbell very well. They pushed Bruce Campbell front and center when they were doing all the promotion for the series, and they said there was bits and bobs in the promotion, bits in the chatter in the trade press about how they, like, broadcasting standards and practices, or rather Starz in-house standards and practices department did not come back to them and said, you can't do this much or you can't do the other. It is blood-soaked and action-packed. And it did get axed, so it was 3 seasons, and it simply came down to numbers. Like most things, it comes down to a numbers game, and the viewing figures just steadily declined to the point where Starz, after banging on for 2-3 years that we're making this for the fans and it's a gift for the fans, oh no, there's not enough fans, so we're going to turn it off, sorry. And it just wasn't enough numbers, and the fans took to frantically tweeting Netflix and Amazon Prime to get them to try and pick it up again, but they declined. But yeah, it was essentially just not enough people were watching it, which is a shame because it is hilarious.
And it's weird that I think someone mentioned earlier another show that was on one network in America, and then over here it's on Walking Dead is on Disney Plus here. Yes. And Ash versus Evil Dead is on Netflix here.
Yeah.
I mean, how does that all, like, sometimes I do get confused as to how it all works in terms of, I guess, different territories and things.
Yeah, so Ash vs Evil Dead and Netflix, that's just a license deal. Netflix pay a license to Starz to have it. At some point the license will run out, so you might notice that, particularly, you know, if you're teaching, you'd be like, oh, use an episode of that in a lecture, then you go and it's gone off Netflix. Yeah, no, usually because the licenses run out. Right, okay, so when The Walking Dead started, Fox, Stacey, you know this, Fox International Channels. So Fox International Channels is an international distribution network arm of Fox. They acquired the license from AMC to distribute The Walking Dead internationally. AMC didn't have the wherewithal to do that, like they didn't have international channels, they just had their channel in the States. So Fox, FIC, Fox International Channels, they distribute it globally. Last year, 2 years ago, I don't know, time has gone because of COVID, when Disney bought Fox, they then have now everything that Fox International have. So that's why The Walking Dead is on Fox. And that's why, or rather Disney Plus here, and that's why whenever I see posters for The Walking Dead in the UK now and they've got the Disney logo on, it really makes my teeth itch. I don't like it. But yeah, it's licensing deals, who owns what, and how things get shifted around. It's really boring.
And you just mentioned COVID there. I mean, I guess I feel like I have to ask, in terms of your research into the industry and the conditions that create, these trends and cycles and things. So what do you feel like the impact of the pandemic and COVID will be on future cycles of TV horror?
Oof. Well, it definitely had an impact on The Walking Dead. Like, that all got slowed down. The much promised films that Rick was supposed to return in, we're yet to see that. They keep dragging their heels and saying, "Oh, we're waiting for the right writers and stuff," and it's like, I think you've just changed your mind. You're not telling us. So we saw it impact as it was happening. In terms of future, I think, and I would see if Stacey and Shellie would agree, with things like what was it, Army of the Dead, was it, that was released straight to Netflix? So I think we might see an impact in terms of where things go rather than what it will look like in terms of the horror content. I think there's definitely been a shift in perception of, well, maybe we don't need to fight for this to be in a cinema release. Maybe do we get enough from a Netflix release or a Shudder release? So I think where things land, the shakedown of that will be quite interesting, I think. But I'm sure we'll see lots of pandemic-y, zombie-y, outbreak-y horrors for a while to come, whether we're on TV or anywhere else, which I'm sure we can all look forward to, as if we're not traumatized enough.
Yeah. So I always I do a horror and science fiction module with my students, and I've kind of said, do you think that we're going to get all this pandemic themed stuff, and would you watch it? And most of them are like, no. we don't want this.
No more.
And I guess we're coming up to 8:30. I think we're that's a good place to end it all. And thank you so much to Stacey and Shellie for being a part of this amazing discussion. And I think we all need to celebrate Stella's book. It is released. It is birthed.
Oh, there it is. Thank you.
I don't know if Kate is there, whether I should bring her in now to kind of wrap things up. Kate, if you don't mind.
Hi everyone, congratulations again, Stella, as well, on your brilliant book. Yeah, just to finish up, I was just going to put this in the chat, but I might as well say it in person. This is our last event, as I said, of this academic year. Oh, which of the two cats is that?
This is Ennio. He's just walked in, just at the end. Sorry, I had to bring him on.
No, that is a nice way to end our Weekday Night Bite series for this year, with Ennio coming to congratulate Stella and to sort of bring this all to a close. Just to say, I'll put it in the chat as well while I'm speaking, that obviously, keep an eye out, as I'm sure you will do, anyway, on our Twitter feed and our website, because we will be announcing, we're already starting to think ahead and plan events for next year. So keep an eye out on both those places in terms of announcements of things forthcoming for the new year, and also to access all our videos of this event. This event will be up there soon, and also all our past events as well. And we've got a lot now. We've got 2 years worth of events for you to enjoy, to go back and watch again if you like. And just to say, thank you everyone for a great last event of the year, and everyone go out and buy Stella's book.
Or
Thanks,
get your libraries
everyone.
to, because it's fiendishly expensive. So get your libraries to buy it.
Okay, yeah, get your libraries, get on there, get on your library order forms or whatever, and get it bought that way. Brilliant. Thanks everybody. Take care.
Thank you.